All right, hello everyone. We're at the top of the hour, so we're going to get started. Just a quick reminder to everyone in the audience, all of the posters are available for viewing on the IBTN website. So you can check your emails or go to the conference website and you can look at all those great posters. There's lots of great content there. Right now, we're going to start this session titled Innovation in Digital Behavioral Interventions, and we've got a great group of speakers and two moderators for this session. The first speaker is Predrag Klasnja. He's an assistant professor in the School of Information at the University of Michigan and an associate scientific investigator at the Kaiser Permanente Washington Health Research Institute. He works at the intersection of human-computer interaction and behavioral science, and he studies how mobile technologies can help individuals make and sustain lifestyle changes needed to improve their health. He's particularly interested in the design and evaluation of just-in-time adaptive interventions, technologies that continuously adapt their functioning to provide optimal support to individuals as their needs and circumstances change. Then next up, we'll have Dr. Hekler. He's a director of the Center for Wireless and Population Health Systems, a center of excellence for digital health within the Qualcomm Institute, and associate professor in public health and the design lab at the University of California, San Diego. He works on methods for optimizing behavioral interventions and helping people help themselves. And then finally, the last speaker will be Dr. Marie-Pierre Gagnon. She's a full professor at the Faculty of Nursing at Laval University and scientist at the Vitam Research Center in Sustainable Health and the Quebec University Hospital Center. Since 2012, she's held the Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Technologies and Practices in Health, and her research program focuses on the evaluation of digital health technologies, the organizational, professional, and individual determinants of digital health adoption and integration into the healthcare system, patient and public involvement in healthcare decisions, systematic reviews, and best practices in knowledge translation and application. And then to facilitate the discussion at the end, we have two moderators. The first is Dr. Alex Rothman. He's a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota. His research program is comprised of a synthesis of basic research on how people process and respond to health information with the development and evaluation of theory-based interventions to promote healthy behavior. He's the past president of the Society for Health Psychology and was the founding president of the Social Psychology and Health Network. He co-developed and led the NCI NIH-sponsored Advanced Training Institute on Health Behavior Theory and the NHLBI NIH-sponsored Advanced Training Institute on Health Behavior, read the same line again, accumulating data to optimally predict obesity treatment or ADOPT, Core Measures Project. And he currently co-chairs the NCI Cognitive, Affective, and Social Processes and Health Work Group. And then finally, our last moderator is Dr. Berman. She's a clinical psychologist in addictive behaviors with a research focus on assessment and low threshold digital treatment of addiction within a behavioral medicine perspective. Her overall research goal is to reduce the treatment gap, which arises when people with signs and symptoms of problematic addictive behaviors as well as mental health issues remain unaware of their inner experiences as problems can be assessed and treated and they do not seek help. She's based at the Karolinska Institute and Uppsala University, where she leads a research group on digital interventions for problematic substance abuse, building and evaluating components of a step care model, including alcohol, drugs, and gambling. She is a distinguished career contributor from the behavioral medicine in 2018, and she's currently the president-elect for the International Society of Behavioral Medicine. Lots of great speakers and moderators here, and we will get started first with Predrag Klasnja. We'll get the slides pulled up.
And
Predrag, as soon as they're pulled up and you see a full screen, you should be able to click right on it, and then you can use your arrows or your
and I should be able to move this into a slideshow mode as well, right?
Correct.
Right.
You should just have to advance slides.
Okay.
There you go.
Oops. except we are not at the start. There we go.
All right.
Thanks, Angela, and thank you all for sticking around for this session. I'm going to be building on a lot of the work that has come earlier in this conference, including Ken Friedman's talk earlier today on early stage studies and pilot studies. And really what I want to talk about is this question of how we can make formative work in early stage studies in behavioral, around digital behavioral interventions more efficient and more effective for learning as much as we can from the studies that we conduct. And I'll just start with a relatively provocative statement that when it comes to designing digital behavioral interventions, we still don't know what we're doing, right? And we've made some progress, but to a large extent, there are a lot of unanswered questions about how we can design these interventions to be truly effective. And so just to give you a few examples, so even things that are that we thought we understood relatively well, like SMS-based reminders, which can be shown in a number of studies to work well for increasing adherence. Here's a recent paper on a 3-year trial of using SMS reminders for increasing adherence to hormone therapy after breast cancer. And basically the reminders didn't do anything at all. No effect at all. And the question is why, right? Was the timing wrong? Was the tone of the messages wrong? Not working? Did people just completely habituate and stop noticing it? It's really hard to tell, right? It was a 2-arm trial. And so basically none of the dynamics of the functioning of this intervention could be really teased out from how the trial was conducted. We have interventions that work well in one context, and then when we try to replicate them, they don't work at all. So here's an example of TextMe trial that was a SMS-based intervention for lifestyle change in chronic disease management. It worked really well in the Australian context where it was originally developed. When it was carefully transferred to the Chinese context, and the investigators did a really wonderful job of trying to match the intervention very well and do all of the cultural adaptations that needed to be done to trial this intervention in China, we had absolutely no results. Again, it's really hard to tell what was going on and why it worked in one context and not in the other. And finally, here's a notorious study that John Jakisic and colleagues did a couple of years ago, where they concluded that wearable devices do not help with weight loss. When you actually dig deeper, it showed that basically the adherence to the wearables that they were using to do self-monitoring was extremely poor. So in a number of studies, both this one and others, we seem to find that how these technologies are designed matters just as much for how they're perceived and how they're experienced, and therefore for the efficacy of them, as the behavior change techniques that are used that are being implemented in these studies. So what is happening a lot of the time is that we do some early formative work that results only in relatively superficial understanding of the nuances of the functioning of these interventions, and then we throw them into large trials, and they perform less optimally than we would hope. And so the question is, how do we do better, right? How can we design interventions that are actually truly effective and that move the needle on the changing the health behaviors that are so key for managing chronic diseases and for helping people be healthy. And so I'm going to start with what I hope is a common goal for all of us, which is that twofold. One is we want to design interventions that are maximally effective, right? We want to design tools that are as good as we can get them. But at the same time, we want to be able to run studies that help us learn as much as we can about the tools that we're building and the underlying behavioral principles on which these tools are based. What I want to argue that if these are our goals, then really the way we should be thinking about the studies that we run is that they have to actually truly advance science and not just be quality assurance for the intervention packages, right? When we're doing behavioral science as a science, rather than being a health center like Kaiser Permanente that just wants to know is a particular intervention that they're considering for inclusion in their health plan actually effective or not. What we want to do is we want to do more than just do efficacy trials that just say whether something is working or not, but to really truly understand the functioning of these systems that we're building and the dynamics of the behavioral processes and the psychosocial processes that are underlying their functioning. And so that's, from my perspective, this is really what the goal should be for behavioral science around in this domain of digital behavioral interventions. And if that's the case, how do we do this? I wanted to argue that really we should be thinking of the formative and small end studies that we do at the start of the development of behavioral interventions as bench science in the wild. Really, we should be thinking of these studies as being intended to really understand and optimize each aspect of the intervention in the context of its real world use. So we want to be understanding how our systems are functioning, whether they're actuating the mechanisms that they're intended to actuate, and the sort of the boundary conditions under which each particular component is working or it's not working. And if you're going to do that, I think there are three particularly important points to keep in mind. One is that we might actually want to be thinking about individual intervention components as analytical units that around which these studies are based, right? And this is a little bit different than thinking about something like MOST that is focusing on individual components, but it's really focusing on components in terms of trying to select components that are going to be included in the package down the line that is going to be trialed in an efficacy trial. Here we can do that with some of these early stage studies, but also I think we want to be actually understanding the functioning of each individual component separately, and I'll be coming back to that in a minute. The other one, and then if we're going to be understanding how these components are working, we really want to be assessing the effects of these components on their proximal outcomes. And I'll be explaining in a second what I mean by that, all of which will then allow us to really to understand the dynamics of functioning of each component and the boundary conditions under which those components work or don't work. And so in the rest of the talk, I want to go quickly through what I mean by these three points and then give you a couple of examples of what that might look like. So let's start with individual intervention components. Really, the reason to focus on individual components is because that's the best way that we can answer a question of how do we effectively design a component, right? Whether that component is in implementing goal setting or planning or feedback or whatnot. Develop that is delivered in a particular kind of modality as through a mobile phone app, through a text message or whatnot, for a particular population in a particular context. And so when we think about individual components as the units that we're trying to study, what that allows us to do is to, first of all, more directly assess how effectively those components are actuating the mechanisms that underlie the functioning of that particular component, right? Since each component should be targeting one or more distinct mechanisms, when we're thinking of the components as analytical units, we can actually put into our studies tests of whether those mechanisms have been getting actuated. We can then try to look at the conditions under which those components are effective. Do they work better in one context or another, for example? And I'll be giving you an example of that, but you can think of things like location, right? For a lot of these digital interventions that are delivered through mobile phones, people can use them in all kinds of contexts. And it might be that a particular component works better in one location than another location, or one part of the day versus another part of the day. What it also allows us to do is we can also more efficiently test different designs of a component. So we can actually try to figure out if a particular component can be designed in multiple ways, which of those ways is going to give us a most effective way of actuating the mechanisms we're trying to actuate. And finally, and I find this really to be a key concept, is that when we're focusing on individual components, we start building an evidence base that is much more readily reusable, right? We can actually take a component that was tested in one intervention, in one context, and test it in a different population or in this different context and see, does this work in that context as well for a different behavior or for a different population? So we can start understanding how a particular kind of behavior change technique needs to be implemented so it works effectively for different behaviors and for different populations. And so when you're focusing on individual components versus a complete intervention package, you can start teasing out those kinds of nuances in a very direct way. And finally, how do you do this? Well, optimally, what you'd want to do is you'd want to randomize the provision of the components of interest, both across participants and for things like text message or notifications, which we call push components, within a person, right? And so what you're wanting to do is you want to be able to address questions like in what situations is this working, for whom is this particular component working, and randomization ends up being a really key tool for doing this. But furthermore, to maximize the efficiency of these kinds of studies, we can also start looking at randomizing not only individual components in the sense of whether we provide it or not, but different variations of those components. And all of that can be done in the same study as I'll show you in a little bit. And then the final part of this is that we really want to be using efficient trial design so we can learn as much as we can from a single study. So factorial experiments are a prime example of this. Micro-randomized trials is another example, and then Eric will be talking in just a little bit about system ID experiments is another way to really address this, advance this agenda. When we talk now, let's turn to proximal outcomes, because they're really key for doing the kind of research in early stage studies that I have in mind. So really what we mean by proximal outcomes is that they're most immediate intended effects of an administration of a single dose of an intervention component. And what the dose is going to vary from one intervention to another, but you can sort of think about something as an example where you have an intervention to help someone disrupt sedentary behavior, right? And if after, let's say, 40 minutes of sitting, a little reminder pops up that can be on your phone or on your desktop, that particular reminder is considered a dose, right? And if that's the case, the proximal outcome for that reminder is whether the person gets up and stretches their legs in some amount of time after the reminder is provided, right? So in this particular case, the outcome is tied to a single delivery of the reminder. You might have a different kind of intervention where you might think that it might take, let's say, 3 or 4 messages provided over the course of a week to make a change, to create a change to something like self-efficacy, right? In that case, a whole week worth of those messages would be a dose. And then the reading of the self-efficacy measure at the end of the week would be the proximal outcome for that component. And really, you can sort of think about these proximal outcomes as being 2 flavors, right? There might be micro versions of the distal outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So you might have something like a 15-minute walk or a bout of activity being a proximal outcome in a causal path to wanting to get someone to walk 10,000 steps a day. Or there might be mediators, right? There may be psychosocial constructs or behavioral constructs that are mediators in a causal path to distal outcomes, right? So interactions with absentee supporting friends, for example, in a substance use intervention might be a proximal outcome for one component, even though staying sober is really the distal outcome that we're aiming for. And really these things sort of sit there between the actual provision of the intervention and then the chain of outcomes that need to be actuated before we get to the distal health outcomes that we're all aiming for with our interventions. So in this case, if you have something like a prompt to walk, then maybe there's increased readiness to walk that we might be able to detect through something like neuroimaging as one proximal outcome, or sort of a bout of walking within the 30 minutes of that prompt as a behavioral outcome that can also be measured as a proximal outcome for that particular intervention component. All of which should then over time add up to these more distal outcomes related to physical activity and then cardiovascular health. So why do proximal outcomes matter? Well, fundamentally, they give us a way to study the mechanisms that are underlying intervention response, right? You can try to measure mechanistic outcomes like physiological or psychological constructs that should be changed when a particular intervention is provided, as well as behavioral outcomes. So things like bouts of activity or individual meals that we think are adding up to the distal outcomes and the patterns of behavior that we are trying to support. Just as importantly, since proximal outcomes are measured often, right? So they measure longitudinally over the course of the study, they give us a granular way to understand the dynamics of the intervention response, right? So we can understand whether a particular intervention is working really well in the beginning and then the effect starts slowly decaying over time, whether it's periodic in some way, maybe it's based around the flow of a week, right? So we can start understanding exactly how the dynamics of that intervention are taking place. And then we're also able to use, since proximal outcomes are collected again over time, we can look at the context and influence of context on the effectiveness of the intervention. So we can study how the context is moderating intervention effectiveness and look at issues like whether location makes a difference, whether someone's state of mind makes a difference to the effectiveness in the intervention. As long as we keep collecting the contextual data as we are measuring our proximal outcomes, there's a whole set of analyses that can be done to look at the time varying moderation of intervention response. And finally, all of this can then be used to study the dynamics of the intervention. And really what we're after is we want to answer a number of different kinds of questions about the particular intervention component, right? One is just, does the component have any effect on the intended proximal outcomes at all, right? So this is basic test, a sanity test. Is there anything going on here at all, right? But then we can also ask different other kinds of questions as well. We can ask questions about dynamics, like how did the effect of the component changes over time? Does it decay, right? What's the temporal form of the effect? How does that effect differ for different forms of the component? And I'll be giving you some examples of that in a second. What kind of contextual or individual state variables moderate that effect? How is that effect moderated by the effects of other components, right? So because if you're doing randomization of multiple components, you can look at interaction effects as well. And then finally, who's sort of responding to a component and who is not. And so let me just give you a couple of examples of what studies that take this approach might look like. So one is the study of a system called Heart Steps that is a physical activity intervention that my colleagues and I have been developing for a few years. And the first version of this had two very simple push components. One were actionable context-aware activity suggestions that were sent to people as notifications. And the other one was implementation intentions, where we basically would ask people to plan when, where, and how they would be active on the next day. And so the suggestions were tailored on the time of the day, weekday versus weekend, location, weather, to try to make them really actionable to the person's current context. And we had two kinds of suggestions. Ones were suggestions to do a quick walk, something like a 5 to 10 minute walk. And the other ones were really just suggestions to disrupt sedentary behavior. For planning itself, there were just people were asked to plan for the following day, how they would be active. And really here, what we were interested in thinking about is how should planning be designed when it's provided on a mobile phone, right? Should we be doing something like it's done in social psych experiments where we just ask someone to write a plan from scratch? And so what you see on the right is a digital version of that, versus trying to make this less burdensome of people, where we could give them plans that they had previously made and they could just choose a plan from the ones they had made before. And so what we did is we actually did a micro-randomized trial of both of these components, where the suggestions were for activity were randomized 5 times a day for each person, each day of the study. And you see here the percentages, it's how the randomization worked. And here the proximal outcome was the step count in the 30 minutes following the randomization. And then for planning, we randomized every night whether we would give someone a planning intervention or not. And then on days when they were getting a planning intervention, we randomized between creating a new plan or picking a plan from a list. And here the proximal outcome was a step count on the following day. And so what did we find? So for the activity suggestions, if you look at the walking suggestions, there was a small effect that was averaged over the course of the study. People got an extra 60 steps over their mean in the 30-minute period following the randomizations. But what was really interesting here is the dynamics of the walking and sedentary suggestions. The walking suggestions started really strong at the start of the study. So every time we would provide the walking suggestions, people ended up having another 270 steps versus when they did not receive a suggestion. But that effect sort of reduced over time as the study went on and is disappeared after a month. But anti-sedentary suggestions, on the other hand, were purely, the effect of those suggestions was purely based on how many other suggestions we provided in the previous 3 to 5 days. So there was this dose response where the more we bugged people, the less responsive they became. When the system backed off due to randomization, they became more responsive to these anti-sedentary suggestions again. And so there was this really interesting dynamics where anti-sedentary suggestions looked like something like habituation was going on here, while the walking suggestions had a very different kind of response, and they were not actually dose dependent at all. For planning, what was interesting is that open-ended planning actually ended up adding over 900 steps per day versus no planning, but there was absolutely no effect for picking a plan. Even though it's the same construct, like it's the same behavior change technique, when we developed it as a picking from a list, it didn't do anything at all. And
Hedja, you have 1 minute.
Thanks, Angela. And here the effect stayed constant over the 6 weeks, so there was no decay at all. And then just as a very quick second example, there was this intervention we called BerryFit, which was intended to help with physical activity after bariatric surgery. And here we did a sort of a feasibility study over 8 weeks with people, but actually 4 months, so 16 weeks, I'm sorry. But we also embedded a couple of experimental manipulations. We looked at different ways of setting daily step goals And we looked at whether these activity suggestions that we tried in hard types did any good when we send them as text messages versus notifications. And so I'll just end by saying that what was interesting here is that we could actually look at see a difference in how different kinds of step goals performed over the course of 16 weeks, where when the goals were much more variable, they performed a lot better than when they were sort of a much more gradual 60th percentile goal that was used. While the activity suggestions had no effect in this other setting. And partly with what we're speculating is that it had to do with the fact that these suggestions could not be nearly as well contextually tailored as we could do in card steps, where we had people's location information and other kinds of information we could pull from their phone. And so, just to conclude, really what I'm trying to suggest is that this is sort of, you can think of it as a riff on Alex Rothman's 2004 paper on that theories really that there's nothing more practical than a good theory. That we can think of these early stage studies as a way to at a much more granular level understand how our interventions are functioning, how the theories on which these interventions are based are playing out in the real world, to both be able to develop better interventions and to refine the theories of human behavior. And so I'll end there. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Predrag. All right, next up we have Dr. Eric Hekler. We'll do a little bit of a slide change here. And just a reminder, if you've got questions, you can submit them to the question and answer at the bottom of your screen, and the moderators will be asking those later. And Eric, once that gets to be full, you should be able to click on it and advance your own slides.
Yes, looks like I can.
All right.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah, it's very sensitive in the beginning.
Totally. Okay.
There you go. All right.
All right, we're good. Hi, everyone. I've so enjoyed this conference. It's been great to listen in, and I hope this builds on particularly some of the provocative presentations that's already happened. I'm particularly thinking of the work of Linda Powell with Orbit, and then also Ken Friedland and the whole other talk that just happened. So here's the basic take home from what I'd like to sort of discuss for today. In essence, the more likely change is idiosyncratic, the more likely a, quote, continuous tuning intervention is needed. And I'll clearly define what I mean by tuning. For that, if you want to engage in continuous tuning, it requires a trial design, something like a control optimization trial, but also other things like a micro-randomization trial plus reinforcement learning that embeds idiographic optimization. And in particular, I'm thinking both coarse and fine tuning. And I'm sure none of this makes any sense to you now, but I hope it will make sense to you at the end. So first, before I get into this, I want to acknowledge that this is obviously a team effort. I particularly want to thank my very close colleague and friend, Daniel Rivera, who's in the middle of this picture, and then all of our students who have worked on this. And also Predrag, he's a close colleague. He's working a lot on this stuff with us as well. So first, I want to just kind of come to, as a grounding for this, I want to ground in Matt Crowder and Skinner's definition of tailoring from 2000. Any combination of information or change strategies intended to reach one specific person based on characteristics that are unique to that person, related to the outcome of interest, and have been derived from an individual assessment. So notice that there's a lot of focus on the individual here within this framing of tailoring. And so a key thing that I want to try to argue today is that we've had this kind of conceptual ideal of tailoring, but only recently are we getting to the level of methodological sophistication where we can actually do it. And so in particular, I think a key thing to think about is our goal is to try to move towards helping people achieve some clinically meaningful response, as Linda was mentioning with Orbit, you know, in the proof of concept, or I'm forgetting the exact phrase Ken used, but basically that threshold of effect size difference, right? So a key thing in my mind when we think about this is you start looking at this from a time series perspective. If you know, like, how does change actually happen? And so this is, you know, a made up example of physical activity, but you can see, like, often it is very common that, you know, different people have different pathways to get towards, you know, the kind of goal we're shooting for. In this context, we'll just use 10,000 steps a day, even though I know any physical activity researchers, that's not necessarily right. Let's just not get into that conversation for now. For now, we'll just say 10,000 steps a day. So idiosyncratic change, some people, you know, achieve their goals in very different ways. Some people may have this gradual response, like in the middle section of this. Some people might be much more variable, like what's happening early on. You know, some people, they may have this huge life disruption that just totally destroys any habit or routine they had, right? So this is what I mean when I'm getting at the idea of idiosyncratic change. You know, I sort of summarize it as people are different, context matters, both change. The more likely that those three assumptions are true, the more likely it is that the strategies we're going to need to use to help someone change are going to need to take into account those individual differences. So, so with that, I think it sets up a thinking about, well, then what types of interventions can we actually offer? And so I want to be I'm explicitly building on Matt Crowder's definitions and then also Linda Collins' definitions of three different types of interventions: generic, targeted, adaptive, and then I want to offer a fourth of a tuning intervention. So by generic, what do I mean? What is meant by this? This is again straight from Matt's work. So this is the idea of delivering an intervention to the same way to a population. And of course, this is the classic thing that randomized controlled trials helps us to produce. You know, we define inclusion, exclusion criteria. We run, we get an intervention package, and we find, does it work relative to some meaningful comparator? So of course, the next stage, an early version of starting to get into tailoring would be targeting an intervention. And so this is when you're really thinking about how do you sort of identify subgroups of a given population. You could imagine basic things like gender or perhaps race. And what you then do is you explicitly run trials, population-based trials, and you add in moderation hypotheses a priori, you know, where you're clearly testing this should work, you know, differently for men versus women, for example. Okay, so I think these are all relatively standard so far. This is, you know, building on definition from Linda Collins on adaptive intervention. Linda Collins and others, Susan Murphy, I'm sure, helped with this. But it's around adjust provision of support to an individual's changing needs. So now this is where we really are trying to, as the name suggests, adapt or adjust based on how we're seeing someone respond. And so you can see we're getting closer to the definition that Crowder was offering when it comes to tailoring. And the key thing to note here is that right now, all the adaptive interventions we've been doing thus far, well, maybe not all of them, it's never good to say all, but the vast majority of adaptive interventions we've been working from are building this on prior evidence. So we're still using population-based insights. What does this mean? It means all the stuff that Pedja was just describing with micro-randomization trials, but this is also true with SMART trials and whatnot. These trials are based on doing effect size estimates for that individual. And so what this means is that ultimately the decision rules we use to do the adaptation, to basically provide support from one person to the next, is based on how a previous person from a prior study responded, not necessarily this person. Okay, and so that is really the key distinction here. You know, in essence, like, are we building in any sort of mechanism or process whereby we're learning how this specific person is responding to a particular response and using that information to further refine the support? That is in essence what I'm getting at when I'm talking about a continuous tuning intervention. So again, it's the same idea as adjusting provision of support to an individual's changing needs. But now what you're doing is you're adding in what we're labeling as a sort of real-time optimization or radiographic optimization to that individual. And I'll go into great depth on what I mean by this. But to give you an example of this, you can look in the work of Tanzim Chowdhury, particularly her study, My Behavior. And actually Angela and Bonnie were involved in variations of this too. And so, but the focus of that was really asking this question of like, how can we nudge people to engage in more physical activity and diet? And what they did was they basically provided different types of messages, and the ones that people responded more favorably to, they basically started using those more often. You know, and so what it's doing is it's saying, oh, well, you're more responsive to that type of message. Okay, I am going to use that message more. The system isn't in fact saying. That is a form of tuning, is what I'm trying to categorize as a distinction that I think we in the field should be thinking about. So that's the background. Let me show you what this looks like and how this works from a control systems perspective. Oh, sorry, one last thing. Before we get into that, when would this be warranted? Of course, it's not, oh, you don't always need to tune, right? I think there's a most definitely a place for generic, targeted, adaptive, and tuning interventions. In brief, in my mind, it comes down to what is the inherent complexity of the problem. The more dynamic it is, the more multivariate it is, the more that context in particular might come into play, and the more likely something manifests idiosyncratically, the more likely you're going to need to do tuning. And so you can think about this with a lot of different examples. You know, The one I've already brought up is from being non-active to physically active. You know, there's a variety of ways that someone can meet physical activity guidelines. Some people might walk, some people might engage in sports. And then there's a variety of ways that they fit that into their daily life, right? So that's getting into a more and more complex problem space. Another one you could think about would be someone who is experiencing overweight or obesity, you know, and how do we help them move towards maintaining a normal weight? There are many things that are involved in trying to help people engage in getting towards a normal weight. And so suggesting we might need to engage in more and more tuning within that. Other examples could be from smoking to maintaining abstinence, or also mental health issues, such as from being depressed to maintaining good mental health. In my view, a lot of these things are influenced, are complex in that they are dynamic, they are multivariate, and they manifest idiosyncratically, suggesting that there's quite a realm of things that we might want to be thinking about for moving towards tuning. Okay, so if that's the problem, the question, of course, is, well, how the heck do we do it? Well, and so I want to suggest that one area that we can pull from is control systems engineering. And if you don't know much about control systems engineering, this is a very old field, and it's a very, very large field. It is the foundation for supply chain management, for autopilots in planes and boats, and all this other sort of stuff. The central idea of control systems engineering is this idea that they call control theory. And the way you can think about control theory is basically, it's just like making toast. What do I mean by that? Well, when you're making toast, you have a certain level of desired toastiness, if you can see, like on this little darkened one, right? What you want. What you're doing is you have a strategy to basically monitor the outcome, in this case, toast, and you're going to adjust the thing that you can adjust in this context, how much time it's in the toaster, to get to your desired level of toastiness. Okay, so a control theory is really just that simple idea of trying to monitor the thing that you care about and make adjustments until you get there. Of course, toast is a very simple example. There are far more complex versions of controllers. And so one way you can think about this would be thinking about a health coach as an analogous version of a controller. So what does a health coach do? Well, a health coach has a lot of prior information. They have a variety of different behavior change techniques that they might be aware of, such as goals and providing rewards. They also have a strategy to monitor and understand what a person's doing, in this context using an app and whatnot. And they also have a sense on what the desired goal is. This is coming back to this idea of really not grounding this on statistical significance, but more of clinical significance, of like, we're trying to help someone meet a clinically meaningful benchmark for a health outcome. You know, and so the health coach is balancing all this information and providing coaching advice for a person. Well, the controller is doing pretty much those exact same things. And so I'll get into more depth on how that works a little bit more. But for now, just think from a sort of a higher level perspective about it. It's a lot like making toast, and it's a lot like a health coach, but we're turning it into a computational system that can actually do that for us. Okay, so let's talk about this with a continuous tuning intervention example. So the intervention seeks to promote physical activity, in this case, steps per day, among inactive adults by adjusting each day daily step goals that they might provide, and then the expected rewards, which in this context translates into gift cards that they would receive. And this is key. We have an optimization function. We have a clear criteria of success. In this context, it would be 10,000 steps per day. And so if we have, and so you can see this is very analogous to normal stuff that we do. But now what happens that's different? Well, we can't rely on a human to do all the stuff that we need to do all the sort of tuning and adaptation to a person. And so instead what we need to do is we need to build a formalized structure that can handle that. And that is what this is, you know, sort of a simple schematic of it. And I'm sure this doesn't make full sense to you, but long story short, what's going on here is that what we've done is we've built a fully specified mathematical understanding of social cognitive theory. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to make predictions on a person's future responses to given different interventions we might do. Like what happens tomorrow if we give someone a really high goal versus a really low goal, or what happens if we give them high points or low points? What happens if someone's really busy, or if there's a bad weather tomorrow? In essence, what this is doing is you're running all of these plausible simulations using a computational model that you've built, and you're making decisions based on those simulations. It's really just sort of balancing the equation. You know, you run all the scenarios and all the potential contexts that might make sense. You're basing it on how someone responded in the past, and based on that information, you make the decision. Well, tomorrow I'll give them a goal of 7,000 steps or something like that. That is in essence how the controller is working. It's working through making predictions and then using those predictions to make decisions. Okay, so let me walk this through a little bit more. In particular, how do we tune something like that? Well, first you can think about the sort of coarse tuning of if you will, and this is system identification, as Predrag mentioned. So what is system identification? System ID focuses on modeling of dynamical systems, so complex things that change a lot, such as humans, from data, ideally using experimentation, not merely observation. So system ID is really a suite of tools. One of those includes how you design experiments, and I'll show you a system ID experiment in a moment. But this is a key distinction to think about when it comes to system ID. It is focused on estimating and validating a model, like that social cognitive theory model I described, to describe the system. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to get a model that helps us to predict a person's future response. Why? Because if we can predict a person's future response in different contexts, what that allows us to do is it allows us to make decisions based on those predictions. And so hence, this is the coarse tuning. We're basically building a model that helps us to make predictions. Now notice, this is different from most of what you've seen before. And this is where we start making that distinction from an adaptive intervention to a tuning intervention. This is explicitly not an experiment meant to test effect size estimates, which is what we almost always do. We're not trying to study the intervention components in this context. We're trying to figure out, can we make a model that helps us to predict future responses for an individual? Notice again, also, I keep saying individual. This is inherently an idiographic approach. It means it's an N of 1 model. That means that what we're ultimately doing is we can build this on a case-by-case basis. So coming back to that small N frame and the small work that we've been discussing, you can literally run a really rigorous study with one person and learn a lot. And I'll show you that momentarily. Okay, so coarse tuning. Again, this is you can think about this going back to this toast example. What you can run is what's called an open loop system ID experiment. What you're in essence doing is you're adjusting the things that you can adjust. And so with toast, you might be adjusting how much time you put something in, and then there might be differences. In this context, it happens to be bread versus a bagel, but you can imagine people being those differences, right? And you might see that different people respond differently, okay? And so what you get from this is it allows you to do, you can think about it as testing and understanding of each person in each system. And so you're doing this rigorous theory testing on a case-by-case basis where your success criteria is, can I make predictions about what this person's going to do in the future? And then ultimately, the second thing you can do is you can also build individualized tailoring variables from this. So let me again kind of show this forward. This is a system ID experiment that we ran with 20 participants. Again, that's fine for this context because we're doing this very careful, rigorous experimentation for each person. So every analysis I'm showing you right now is a case-by-case context. And then of course you can aggregate, but for now, we just don't have time to get into that. But this is how this open loop system ID experiment is like. What we want to do is we were building this around the idea of an ambitious but doable step goal. In essence, sometimes we want a goal to be high enough such that it challenges them, but not so challenging that it overwhelms them and then they basically start ignoring the goals. So what we ended up doing is we used what's called a pseudo-random signal design, and we don't have time to get into it. But long story short, what we did is we randomize, pseudo-randomize. Sometimes we give people really high goals, sometimes we give them really low goals, and sometimes in between. And you can see that in terms of this signal that you can see here. Similarly, we also designed, and this is orthogonally delivered, a same signal design, but for how many points we'll give them, up to 500 points, which translates roughly to $1, or not. And then of course, with that, we then monitored how often they actually met their goals, which translated into them actually receiving the points that they got, and therefore, and then last but not least, we paid attention to context, such as, is this a weekend or a weekday? And so this in essence is the system ID experiment that we can run. Okay, now, so what we did, we ran this with a trial. This is the Just Walk app that we used for it. We ran it with these participants living in the US, so it is a small trial. But again, we can learn a lot because we're doing this for each person. So ultimately what we were trying to get to is, can we make a prediction? Can we build good predictions for each person? And that's what this bottom thing is showing you. So you can see that black line is their actual steps. That little pink dotted line is the predicted steps from our model. And you can see we're predicting 25%, we're explaining about 25% of this person's variance. And so that's giving us quite a bit of information to make decisions for this person. And you might think, oh, I just cherry picked it. No, we were actually really good at building up individualized models ranging from, explaining 3 to 5% up to like 40% of a person's variance in steps. And so suggesting that we can use quite a bit of information to make informed decisions from this. So this is in essence the course tuning, Now, I'm mindful that I'm starting to get low on time, so I can't get into the great detail on this, but in brief, what we can do is this allows us to figure out what are those individual differences that matter. And so these are each of the different people that were involved and the key variables that mattered for them. And you'll notice it's different for each person. For some people, it's weekend. For some people, it's stress. For some people, it's the base model, which basically meant they were really driven by goals. As we dug into the depth. So when we ran this using the kind of standard stats that I think you're all aware of, we got what you probably would expect, the one with the most people influenced, the weekend. That was basically the variable we should tailor on. But the key thing to note is, if you assume these idiographic tailoring variable selection like we can do with system ID is more accurate, it meant that we are wrong 75% of the time if we use that nomothetic tailoring variable model. That's what I mean by course tuning. We're literally figuring out, oh, that's what influenced you. You're influenced by stress. Great, let's take that into account when we make better decisions, okay? So moving on, let's talk a little bit more about the fine tuning. And
Eric, 1 minute.
Oh, shoot. Fine tuning requires you to have success criteria. And so you can basically think 10,000 steps. This is where we really start bringing in the intervention of the closing loop of the health coach. And so what we have is we have these models and we start closing the loop in terms of the intervention, and so, and I don't have time to really get into the details, but the long and the short of it is every day the system makes a prediction and every day the system gets a counterfactual on how well it did with its prediction. And that's used to improve future prediction and fine tuning the controller to that person. Okay. And so what this is all involved in, you can put this all together again in a single N of 1 trial, what we called a control optimization trial. Now, this is just one example. You don't have to do what we did here. But what you can see is over a course of a time series, we actually embed 3 different experiments into this study. One is basically the open loop system ID experiment, which is basically, let's build a model to make predictions about this person and figure out their individualized tailoring variables. From that, we then add a second one where our success criteria is to help them to get to physical activity levels. The last step after that is to close it, where you actually optimize and try to help people get towards maintenance. And you do this with all the course and fine tuning that I was just describing. So what does this get us? My very last slide. The cool thing here is that we basically align the goals of the individual with the goal of our science. There's immediate benefits to the individuals. We have models that predict their individual's response. We have individualized tailoring variables, and we do course and fine tuning such that we're further refining the intervention to the person. But we also have secondary benefits. This gives us really rigorous study data to do all the stuff that you were just hearing from microrandomization trials as well. So we have this double benefit. So to take home points, the more likely change is idiosyncratic, the more likely a continuous intervention is needed. And continuous tuning requires a trial design like the control optimization trial that embeds idiographic optimization. And I know I just flew through that. Here's references to help you think through that in more depth. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. That was great. Next, we have Marie-Pierre. Maybe. Yes, there we go.
Okay, so you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi.
Hi. As soon as it becomes fuller screen, you should be able to take over and click.
Just try to find, because it's in French for me. So control.
Oh.
It's where Mary.
Yeah, so it will be just at the top left where it says from beginning. Click on that.
Oui, Marie-Pierre, en haut à gauche, c'est marqué from beginning en dessous de fichier ou file. C'est sur le truc de PowerPoint en haut à gauche. Vous voyez?
Sur le truc de PowerPoint.
Oui, sur mettons, vous voyez l'orange en haut à gauche, juste en dessous, ouais, juste ici, c'est marqué from beginning. Et après ça, vous allez pouvoir devancer les diapos sans problème, comme d'habitude.
Parfait. Je pense que, OK.
Sinon, Jen, can she use the bottom thing at the bottom, you know, the thing at the very bottom, like the screen view, like the presentation view icon at the bottom?
She could, yeah. Est-ce que vous êtes capable de cliquer sur le PowerPoint?
No, what?
Oui.
Now I don't have the control.
Oui, je vois que vous avez le contrôle.
Okay.
C'est pas moi qui fais ça.
But, okay, so now my problem is it's not full screen.
Ouais. Donc, vous pouvez aller juste en haut à gauche, où il est marqué « From Beginning ».
Yes.
Cliquez là-dessus.
Okay.
Voilà.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
There
I thought I'd be good. I'm used with technology, but no, this because I wasn't full screen. Okay. Well, thank you. Sorry for this little problem. I'm sorry. I have there's some noise here. Okay. Okay. So, well, thank you very much to the first presenters. I think my presentation is a bit more theoretical. I'm not. I don't have a lot of practical experience with concrete projects, so it will be a little bit more on some thoughts I would like to share with you. Okay. Oh, yeah. As you said, it's really sensitive. Okay, so I don't know if I have. Okay, I'm sorry, I have to go back. Oh, now it's. I don't know. To go. How do I go back?
C'est Guillaume de l'équipe IPTN. Si tu vas en bas, tu vas voir des petites flèches qui vont apparaître, qui sont à peu près transparentes. Si tu descends un petit peu ton curseur, il y a des petites flèches en bas qui sont transparentes. Au bas, à gauche de...
Oui.
Oui. Donc, ça va te permettre d'avancer de cette façon. Voilà.
OK. Sorry. Because I have something, this noise around. I'm trying to close that, but it's okay. It's okay. Okay, let's start. This time is the good time.
Il n'y a vraiment aucun problème. Il faut qu'on s'adapte aussi. Il y a toujours un petit délai.
Okay. No, okay. That's fine. Okay, so first, I think the idea was to present kind of a reflection about the professional and organizational factors that might be interesting to consider in the implementation of digital behavioral change interventions. So the definition that I used to specify what kind of interventions, what the digital behavioral change interventions are, the devices and programs using digital technology to foster or support behavioral change, which is the definition proposed by Nikki and colleagues. As probably most people know, because you're experts in this field, there's some evidence about the effectiveness of these interventions, be them on internet-based, older interventions, on smartphone, or using alternative methods such as serious games. So for a range of behaviors, I don't need to convince you that there's some evidence. Of course, most of the time these systematic reviews show that the effects are quite limited, but there's evidence of the effectiveness. And it's also known that user engagement, so all the individual buy-in, individual factors regarding the acceptance it's important. However, we know less about the factors at the level of professionals, healthcare professionals, behavioral health, social care professionals, and also the organizations. By organizations, I mean healthcare organization, but it can also be school, workplaces, various kind of centers to provide services for people in general. So depending on the field, which field is the behavior under of interest, then organizations are not necessarily healthcare organizations, but at large. And although we haven't really studied what are the specific determinants of successful digital behavioral health interventions, at the determinants at the professional and organizational level, we know that these are important because above the importance of achieving effectiveness, there's also the question of ensuring the adoption, the integration, and also the sustainability of these interventions. And in order to ensure the sustainability, it is known from various fields and all the innovations that support from clinicians and from organizations are key. Some theories can be used to explain what will influence what will be the conditions for successful digital behavioral health interventions. We know we can use the same theories that also inform the interventions themselves, the various psychosocial theories, for instance. This will help us to understand why, for instance, clinician or a healthcare provider or manager will be in favor or will accept the technology that is proposed. We can also look through a lens of the theories of professions. The theories of professions are helpful when it's time to see how the different professional groups, different disciplines share the jurisdiction. So who is in charge of what are the different power relations between the groups. And we often think about, for instance, the physician and the nurses. So there's always some kind of negotiation about who is responsible, for instance, to make sure that people adhere to the interventions, for instance. So these theories can be useful and can give us a lot of knowledge about the dynamics of professions. At the level of the organizational and institutional theories, these work can also be useful because we can understand the various factors, for instance, the structural factors. What are healthcare organizations? It's a really complex type of organizations, but other organizations, non-profit community organizations might be different than healthcare organizations. So by knowing the different configurations of organizations, it also helps us to see how these digital interventions more suitable for large healthcare systems, or is it better to implement it into smaller units, for instance. So the institutional theories will also provide a general view on the different relations between these institutions, for instance. Sociopolitical theories, I don't talk about these aspects, but just asking the question, as the previous presentation, to what extent should we, collect all the data about individuals and their characteristics, and what can be done at a national level to influence the policies and etc. from the digital health intervention. So this is something apart, more to do with the social and ethical aspects, but this can also be a lens that we use as researchers in this field. So particularly today, I want to talk about the professional and organizational determinants that could be helpful to know how to ensure success of these interventions. I couldn't find, perhaps I didn't look for all the good keywords, but I tried to identify a review, to have a global, an overview on the professional factors related to digital behavioral health interventions. I couldn't find any. So I said, well, perhaps there can be similarities with what we have learned from other fields, from different digital technologies in general. And my work had mostly been related to the adoption of telehealth, electronic health records, patient portals, mHealth. So I started looking at the factors that have emerged from the previous studies and try to see if there are specific factors that could be also relevant for the digital behavioral interventions. And from this, I would say, indirect evidence, what we can see is that, for instance, time issues are really important for healthcare providers. It will always be the first reason they provide. They say why it's not working. It's because they say we don't have time to include that into our routines. Okay. It's sometimes said to be an excuse for other factors, but it's still very important to take into account what would be the time required from the providers or the professionals, social or health professionals. The question of it has been named several ways, I would say, but the attitudes or the risk-benefit equation. Will I really get something more with my patients if I suggest or I recommend those interventions? So it's always something that is common, and I think for all digital technologies. Agreement with the technology. So this could be perhaps a point where you can see the way the professionals or the psychologists or physicians or nurses, how do they perceive their own practice? What is the essence of their practice? And then is the technology in agreement, I would say, with their professional norms? So this is a very important factor in the mHealth or other digital health. So I think this could be relevant also to consider that as a compatibility, but more with the way professionals see their practice. And these technologies are really supporting the kind of discourse they can have when they are face-to-face with a patient, or is it very far from that? So this is really a key concept, I would say. And also the familiarity and the literacy with digital tools. If you don't feel comfortable with using that yourself, then it's always difficult to promote it or to recommend it to your clients. Also, I was looking for the reviews, but I found some studies for very specific digital behavioral health interventions. For instance, one study by Henneman that looked more at the e-health intervention. So it was perhaps more distance consultation, but it was interesting to see that on the professional aspects that were the most important, the social factors was mentioned, and I found it interesting because many of the interview providers were nurses, and they mentioned that the attitudes of their colleagues and the patient was one of the factors really that encouraged them or to use the technology. If they felt that in their environment they had this support, then it would be a reason to use the technology. And also the famous risk-benefit equation. So you need to provide professionals with proofs of the effectiveness of these technologies, and various types of, I would say the case reports are sometimes more talk more to the healthcare providers than the systematic review. So if you have both very solid scientific evidence, but also colleagues who have used it and can talk and convince them, so it's a way to ensure buy-in. Another study that was more on coaching, health coaching, also identified, but I would say these are professional factors, but more related to how the professional interacts with the clients using these tools. So the empathic relationship was key, identifying a realistic goal based on the personal barriers. So it has a lot to do with the tailoring we were saying before, and also staying connected. Although it's in the asynchronous coaching, the importance of maintaining this connection between the professional and the client. There are probably many more factors, but these were those that seem to be the most mentioned in the literature, and also to have a lot of importance. For the organizational determinants, there were even less studies about that, so it was the desert, I would say. There was nothing there. So I say, okay, let's see what's there for other technologies. So for the older technologies like telehealth, the teleconsultation, we found that elements related to the size of an organization, so the larger organizations were more would adopt it more because they had more resources, for instance. The presence of physicians in the executive position. So when it's an organization that is managed, the top managers are clinicians, could be an organization that is more open to innovation in the localization. But we had an example with telemedicine where the rural remote aspect was really important for the digital behavioral health intervention. The distance, of course, can be important for clients who live far and don't have necessarily access to a therapy or a program, but it's not the first reason. So for these specific interventions, we need to look at perhaps different factors that relates to the organization. So there are some literature in the field of mental health. So in the field of mental health, we could do some parallel with behavioral health as well. We saw that one of the problems that would limit integration into organization was the fact that there's a lot of available solutions, but not that much based on scientific evidence. So for decision makers in a large organization, buying a product, an intervention that is that does not prove its effectiveness would be difficult. But of course it depends. Okay, I'm from Quebec, from Canada. We have a national system, and I know many of you in the States, it's something completely different. But of course it's with my lens, with a national health system where the organizations won't invest in something unless they're good scientific evidence. But the problem is that by the time you have this evidence, the technology is already outdated. So it's kind of difficult. Also, many healthcare organizations lack the experience of producing or commercializing their own system. And for that, I think can be a collaboration with the academics where you kind of design a technology. As the examples that were presented before, you are a team, a scientific group, you work with organizations, but then is the problem, because when it's time for the business part, usually healthcare organizations and academics, there are several exceptions, of course, but usually it's not as intuitive as for the business sector. So this was another limitations and a condition that would refrain many organizations to really embark on digital health intervention programs. The other factors that were also identified for mental health, digital mental health interventions, were, I would say, a bit more in phase with all the other digital interventions in general, the technological requirements, the time available, what is allowable in clinics. So depending on the offer of services of each type of organizations, where you can what you can provide, and the design. It's always really difficult when you design something that is apart or outside the traditional health and social care system, how you fit with the rest of the organization. So all the referral processes. For instance, in Quebec, there's a lot of pressure to involve all the cognitive behavioral therapies, but then if the person needs to go with more intensive, you don't have the resources to refer them. So it's a problem. So, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of knowledge about the individual determinants. We kind of know what could work or less. There's still a lot of work to do in that field, but we know better. But for the professional factors and the organizational factors, we lack of evidence in order to inform the design of interventions that would be more integrated and sustainable into the system, I would say. So from the evidence, that it's indirect evidence from other fields, there are some determinants that are pretty much the same. It's kind of general determinants on which we always say, oh, we know that, we already know that. But the fact is that in the real life, many organizations keep on doing the same mistakes time after time. So yes, we know it, but it's good to repeat it. And these factors are really important, because you can have the best intervention, but if it's not integrated in the system, people won't benefit from that, because nobody will recommend it, and there will be no reimbursement for it. So we do a lot of work. It's perfect machine, but nobody has the means to buy it, you know. So it's really important. And I think really the message is to document all the implementation aspects. And for that, they exist. I mentioned the CFRI, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, but the projects in the field of digital behavioral interventions also need to consider the implementation aspects. So shortly, a research agenda for research on implementation of digital behavioral interventions. So include professionals and healthcare organizations, representatives such as managers and other stakeholders in the design of these interventions, so they can already inform about that. Use the theories that we are perhaps not much familiar with, but there's a lot of theories from the professions and the organizations that can also help you. And when it's time to evaluate not only the effectiveness, but also the implementation, so consider having a look at these factors. So thank you very much, and sorry for the little technological problems.
No worries. Thank you. So I want to thank Drs. Klasnja, Hekler, and Gagnon for those wonderful talks. And now we'll be bringing on our moderators, Dr. Alex Rothman and Dr. Ann Berman, to kick off a discussion. I've been seeing the questions rolling in. There you go.
Yeah. So, okay, thanks. I will start by asking questions, and I need to transfer to our page with the questions. So let's see, for all the panel, we have quite a few questions here. So I'm just gonna ask a question. The first question here is from Simon Bacon, Dr. Simon Bacon, and he's asking, given that tailoring is probably the key to achieving mass behavior change, how can we best leverage machine learning within digital interventions to get personalization of the interventions? So this is a question to everybody, so anybody can jump in.
I guess I can start and Pedja maybe can jump in. I mean, machine learning is a generic phrase. There's a wide range of different tools. I mean, AI is another generic phrase, artificial intelligence, that are being used. The short answer is it can be used quite a bit, but like machine learning tends to be used in terms of identifying patterns and clustering of data, or supervised machine learning, like, I'm not going to get into those details. The short summary is there's quite a bit we can do. What I was offering was a control systems approach, which is from a different discipline, control systems engineering. So it's a bit more of an engineering perspective, where it really grew out of this idea of how do we make decisions in dynamic, complex environments. But most definitely there are very good computer science methods, and I'm basically teeing this up for Pedja because we've been working closely on this with like reinforcement learning, and so I'll just be quiet and sort of to get back up for Pedja.
Thanks, Eric. The approach that we have been taking with our interventions, and this is what much of this work is in collaboration with Susan Murphy, who is now at Harvard, is to use reinforcement learning to do personalization of delivery of particular components for a single person. But then the methods that we're developing right now is to be able to actually look at the data for the whole cohort and try to figure out in what circumstances which people are similar and where they're responding differently, and then to do adaptive pooling where we can actually take the patterns that are emerging from the data and use those to more intelligently provide personalized support to each person. And the problem here, of course, is that a lot of the mobile health data is sparse, right? So it might be that you provide an intervention for a particular person in a certain context only a small number of times, right? And so you want to be able to speed up the learning. With centered machine learning techniques, you need a lot of data to be able to learn. And so you want to be able to speed up the learning by leveraging data from other people while still providing personalized support that makes sense for each person. And so the idea here is that when someone's in certain contexts, when a person seems to look different than other people, you pull less, and you just try to pull on that person's own, try to learn on that person's own data. And then when that person looks similar to other people in a certain context, then you pull more, and then you can use what you've learned from other people to inform how the intervention is provided. But the idea is very much to try to provide as best of a personalized treatment to each person as we can, and and the idea here is, when you can, you learn from others, and when you can't, you just have to learn on that person's own data.
Great, that was, yeah. Anybody else from the panel want to respond on tailoring? It doesn't sound like it. Should I go on here, or Alex, do you want to ask a question?
Okay, I'll go. We'll go back and forth.
Okay, great.
So I'll ask a question that, and maybe I should just say and I will say with apologies that we probably won't get to all of the questions that were asked, and so we apologize ahead of time for that. Dr. Linda Carlson asked in response to part of Eric's talk, but I actually think it can be all of our speakers may want to chime in on is, and she says, in the continuous tuning example, just wondering how the intervention components, in this case it was step goals and reward points, were chosen. I can see how the levels are tuned, but are the components themselves just based on previous research showing what kind of intervention components are useful? And I might, because I have the prerogative of the question asker, say just more broadly, sort of where are you turning for the key components and even the key sort of theoretical targets that you're going after in your interventions? And that I'd ask that of Pedja as well.
Yeah, awesome question. Short summary is this is why we're so interested in building a robust accumulation of knowledge. And so, when we made our selections, we were very careful of, I always tell my students where I triangulate around 3 different things to help make decisions. One of them is prior evidence, the second is theory, and then the third is the actual people we're trying to help. And so we used all of that in our triangulation efforts to sort of land on the intervention components that would make sense in this context. The evidence goal setting is one of the, if not, I think it is the most common behavior change technique based on meta-regression attribution analyses within these digital health tools. It works very well. It also has heterogeneity of response. There's a variety of different work that's been done for adaptive goal setting that we've built on, that I helped work on with Mark Adams and others. And then the rewards and points, we are consciously building on an operant conditioning feedback loop as sort of the essential initial feedback loop system, which fits very well into a control theory frame of mind. And so basically, you know, stimulus, response, consequence, we want to control our loop. Stimulus, goal, response, the behavior, consequence, rewards, loop. And so that was very consciously the foundation of our thinking from a theoretical perspective, which then translated into social cognitive theory as well, particularly, I won't bore you with the details, but if everyone wants, you can get into our papers around the importance of self-efficacy to actually build, how do we actually build an accumulation? Because it's not really just about the individual moment, but it's really like, is someone building up skills and capacity? Self-efficacy is a particularly important variable to be mindful of, and it actually truly foundational from our modeling perspective to allow us to actually get the type of anticipated growth and learning that we would need to be able to do this sort of slow growth structure.
Yeah, so I'll just add a little bit. By and large, the way my projects work are very similar to what Eric was describing as well. So a lot of it is coming from prior evidence, just because, I mean, we can't reinvent the whole behavioral science overnight, nor should we, right? And so a lot of the components that we're using, like implementation intentions and goal setting and so on, very much come from what we see as the strongest prior evidence we have for what things work for a particular intervention. The two things that I will add is that even for those, there's a lot of that prior evidence underspecifies in terms of how you actually implement those things, right? And so part of what we're trying to do with these studies is figure out, like, okay, so you want to do goal setting or you want to do planning, how do you do that effectively? And partly, so there we then try to come up and figure out what's the design space here. Like, if I want to use this particular tool, like let's say mobile application, what are the various ways I could do this? And then we use more sort of user-centered design methods to try to come up, to narrow that list to some set of options that seem both feasible, that fit the context in which we're trying to work, and that might be worth investigating. And then we try to actually put those into studies to pit them against each other to try to figure out which ones seem to be working better. So partly is we're trying to sort of fill that space between theoretical constructs and behavior change techniques that are defined at a relatively abstract level, and then actual operationalizations of those constructs at the level of technological interventions, where a lot of details have to be filled out, where we don't really have good prior work for what is going to work and what is not. And so the purpose of the kinds of studies that I was advocating for is to start building that kind of evidence for what concrete operationalizations work when and for whom. And the other piece then is that also, since these kinds of early studies are relatively cheap, like if you have a hunch for something that might work, even if it's not really well grounded in prior theory, it's actually relatively inexpensive to try to build a lo-fi version of that and try it. And and this is very much in line with the agile science that Eric and I have been developing over the last few years, is that you can actually start building new components that might not align really cleanly with what we know from prior theory. Try some versions of that, and then if you see some signal, if you see that there might be something there, then one can investigate more closely about how is this thing working, why is this thing working. And so this is much more of a direction where someone coming from computer science or human-computer interaction might come, where people sort of rely on some design intuitions to come up with versions of treatments that they put into their systems without necessarily understanding particularly well how this might work. But some designers are quite talented, and they end up coming up with things that work pretty well. But then we need to understand what is actually underlying these interventions, and to be able to push back on to develop theory based on the things that we're discovering. So it's this iterative process of relying on theory, trying to build interventions based on what we know from the prior evidence, filling in the gaps between the abstract concepts and concrete operationalizations, and then adding things that might come from countries or good design intuitions, and trying to understand what underlines things for which we find signal.
Great. These were really interesting responses. It's so inspiring. And here comes a more practical question posed by Dr. Kim Lavoie, which is really about sustainability of the behavior produced by the mHealth intervention. And what she's asking specifically is, when you design digital interventions and decide on underlying theoretical models, which you're talking about, and Eric, choosing rewards would seem to render the user forever dependent on the intervention or app or whatever to maintain the behavior of the long term. So how could we build digital interventions that develop more autonomously regulated behavior, for example, using self-determination theory, which I've also been thinking of here, so that people don't no longer need these constant rewards and nudging forever. I want to add there that we also know that people don't use apps in a long, sustained way. And as you pointed out, I think they stop using, and then you have to, or maybe it was Eric, fine tune the interventions to keep their attention and engagement. So yeah, so what about the sustainability, and when can they let go of the security blanket of the app?
So I think that I totally agree. This is what I actually sort of think of myself as having 3 waves to the types of work I do. One is around optimizing adaptive interventions. Second one is helping people help themselves, which is very much inspired by the idea that I found my algorithms creepy. I'm in essence building manipulation machines, what I just described. And I think we'll all be mindful of that. That actually is a very serious comment. We need to be mindful of the moral and intended consequences of our work. And then the third is collective action, seeing how we can build and scale work. I'm particularly interested in the idea of community-driven design. So in terms of the issue of sustainability, I think that I appreciate your linkage to self-determination theory and whatnot. Our central strategy we're working on within this, and particularly the way the controller fine-tunes, if you will, I didn't get a chance to get into this in depth, but we actually are, again, building it on prior behavioral theory, and particularly using an expanding variable reinforcement schedule built into the controller design. The general idea is to basically wean people off of the tech, whereas at the maintenance stage, so basically I didn't get into this, but the success criteria for initiation is get someone to the clinically meaningful target. The success criteria for maintenance is leave them alone. And basically just shut everything off. Stop giving them points, stop giving them goals, let them do their thing, and only turn back on if they need it. And then do that based on robust, rigorous behavioral science, particularly thinning reinforcement schedule. Now, could you also do this with self-determination theory context, particularly thinking more about autonomy, relatedness, competency? Most definitely. This is just one early example that fit well into control theory with an operant conditioning feedback loop. But so I wholeheartedly and deeply appreciate the comment, and I also think there are ways to do it even in the way that we've built it. And if it's, of course, it's an empirical question. We'll see. We have our 7th percentile rank R01 that we'll actually get the NOA in the next few weeks. So I'll let you know.
I guess the thing that I would add is that I'm not sure we do that great about maintenance even for non-technological interventions. And so I think the technological delivery is, in that regard, not necessarily all that different. But the thing that it can do, and it is and Eric was alluding to this, is we might be able to actually build tools where we back off as people internalize these control mechanisms that are related to behavior, leave them alone while just maintaining some level of low level monitoring. And then just pick up when that intervention is needed. So even for someone who has a lot of autonomy, or who even, just to push it further, whose identity has now been tied to the new behavior, when things change dramatically, like this pandemic happened, right? It might be that all the things that you were doing, let's say in the context of physical activity, now fell apart. Like my bouldering gym is closed, I was not able to bike outside, and all of a sudden there's still a need to try to replace those behaviors and the routines that you've been creating with something else, and the system can pick up on that and then start to provide more support as well. So I think my sense of this is that yes, we want to be helping people internalize motivation for the behaviors, but at the same time, in most other aspects of our lives, we are okay with some level of support, right? So you keep on using your glasses for the rest of your life, right? And so having some low level setup where the intervention can be available to pick back up when it's needed, from my perspective, is probably not a horrible thing. What you don't want is a complete dependence where the person completely falls apart when their phone is not there. But I think that there are areas between that extreme and the extreme of that we don't need absolutely anything at all, with that is actually pretty interesting to explore.
Okay, great. I thought maybe it would be nice to sort of maybe shift this question to Marie-Pierre and ask you to sort of reflect a bit on on, you shared with us some really interesting thoughts about how ultimately these interventions are going to need to be situated in a variety of different complex organizations that have their own features and characteristics. And I sort of took away from your talk sort of the observation that has proved challenging to date. Okay, and now we have Eric and Predrag showing us digital interventions that are at a level of complexity that is, I'll just say, daunting. And so I'd be curious, as you know, what your thoughts are in both, maybe almost, I'd almost want to say, if you're willing to, but please take it wherever you want, sort of the advice you would give to people like Eric and Predrag who are building this next generation of digital health interventions. Are you optimistic that there would be uptake for these within organizations? Would they go? Would the leaders go running away screaming? Please, I'd love your thoughts on this.
Well, I'm always optimistic, and I think one of the problem why it's not well integrated because they were not as effective as we thought they would be. So all the question of the sustainability of the behavior is important. So this kind of work, trying really to improve the interventions are great, because it's the first reason the professionals and the organization will adopt it if they see the benefits, of course. But then, yeah, you were right, the complexity, okay, it's there, and there's a lot of actors in the organizations, various professionals. So as I mentioned, my advice is to include them, not in the fine-tuning of one intervention for one individual, but in a global way. Is it the right direction we are taking, and thinking that I'm sure you probably both work with a multidisciplinary team. So the question of implementation, you have collaborators who can take that also, because yeah, the sustainability of the behavior, but you have to sustain also the system that is supporting. And for that, you need the organizations to be involved quite early in the design. Organizations and of course the professionals. So it's not a magic bullet. It's collaboration and try to work together in these complex interventions.
Yeah, I guess I would add that I completely agree. And basically co-designing these interventions with let's say a healthcare organization is really key. And so this Benefit project that I've only touched on at the end, we designed that with the bariatric surgery team at Kaiser Permanente, Washington. And and they were there from the very start. A lot of the constraints that on the system came from them. The reason we ended up with text messages is because it's a kind of technology that the healthcare system could implement afterwards. So we didn't, that allowed for really also broad access to the patient population. But even with that, some of the decisions that we ended up making, for example, that we provided no real-time access to the patient's data because the surgeon says there is no way we would ever have time to look at this. So what we would do is that we would actually print PDFs of the reports, of the patient reports, and email them to surgeons before the in-person visits. Because that's the only way they could actually deal with the data, is at the time when they were going to see the person, the patient in person anyway. And so we just needed to provide it in a form that they could deal with. And so for any, I think, so to making sure that things are fitting the workload, that they're fitting the priorities, that they're fitting with the liability model that the organization has and so on, are absolutely paramount if any of this stuff is going to be used by outside of the research setting.
And I guess if I could just briefly build in this, I totally agree strongly. I think one of the things to think through methodologically is how do we align our success criteria, what we're striving for? And in particular, this is something I went into depth on a recent paper with Christine Hunter, Jasmine Tiro, and Camille Nebeker. Long story short, when we classically do our research, when we're doing population-based work, the success criteria is a little bit more distal, right? You're trying to get generalizable knowledge, which then cascades down to helping the clinic. When you're doing more of this tuning style approach, where you're taking an idiographic approach, you can actually align the success criteria. Everybody's trying to help the individuals you're trying to help with. And so there are ways to actually do all the partnership, everything you were just describing, but the central element is to really think about, like, what are we all shooting for? Do we want someone to get to X, whatever that X is? And then when you do something like tuning, you actually can build you can really align on that. And sorry, I know that's kind of vague, but I would invite you to kind of look at that recent Precision Health paper to go into more depth on that.
Okay, so that was a really great question, and it was really great answers and bringing together sort of different parts of this. And I think I'm going to use just the final minute or two we have to ask another question that I'm asking Marie-Pierre first, and then maybe you guys can chime in. And that is, suppose I were a manager, I was an early adopter, and I saw these things. I happened to read some papers, and I thought, wow, I want to introduce some of this. Is there any kind of supportive procedure or toolkit, like, for example, normalization process theory, or maybe something else that Marie-Pierre, you would recommend from your perspective? You know, how would I go about this?
Well, I think you probably have a good experience, because yeah, the normalization process theory would be a good way. But most of the time, when you want to introduce it, you don't really think in terms of theory. You want to experiment something, you want to improve your services. So it's a good point you're mentioning. Having as a clinician, I want to introduce that. So what would I do? I never saw it and in that way, but I would definitely have a really a look at both the evidence and other experiences in similar organizations, and try to see what are the requirements. This is major, because as you mentioned, for the project in bariatric surgery, the clinicians, they don't have time. So if you add some more, it's not possible to work. You really need to know the routines and have a really good fit with your routines. That's, most of that don't really need theory, but of course, if you have some implementation models behind, you can look at, if you're more at a larger macro level, you can use some models of readiness. So you have tools to assess if the organization is ready to implement evidence-based digital interventions. So yeah, but there's not a lot of examples. I don't know a lot of examples where they really use implementation theory in this field, but it could be a good study to do.
I think we're out of time, and I want to thank our speakers and our moderators for this wonderful panel. I want to give a couple of reminders. Be sure to check out the posters. Thank you. I'm posting the link in the chat box if you need that. And then be sure to return in about 50 minutes to our next session on conducting patient stakeholder-oriented research. Thank you all.
Thanks everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.